The first hint of its death came at 15,000 feet over Marcus Island, in a sky so violently blue it felt like the world had been stripped down to its bones. Petty Officer Yoshio Fukui steadied his breathing, the thin air burning the inside of his chest as he leaned forward in the cockpit of his A6M Zero. Sweat rolled down his spine despite the cold. Beneath him, the Pacific glimmered like polished steel. He spotted them 6 dark shapes climbing from the southeast. For a half-second, the sunlight distorted their outlines, and Fukui thought they were 25 seconds. Big, slow, predictable. Targets. He tightened his grip on the stick, preparing the familiar dance he'd perfected dozens of times. Then the shapes banked. Not bombers. Fighters. And not any fighters he recognized. The silhouette was wrong, too broad-shouldered, too thick, too heavy to be agile. The wings looked too short for the body. The fuselage looked like a battering ram with a propeller. A design mistake, he thought. Another American error. Another victim waiting to be outturned, outmaneuvered, outclassed. He exhaled once slow. This will be quick. He rolled into a diving turn, the Zero slicing through the air with the elegant brutality that had dominated the Pacific for 2 years. Every nerve in his body expected the same pattern, the heavy American fighter continuing straight, unable to match his turn radius. The Zero curving behind it like a blade through silk. But the American aircraft didn't keep turning. It didn't even try. It went vertical. A straight, impossible climb, like it had been launched from the sea by some invisible catapult. The roar of its engine echoed through Fukui's canopy, a deep-throated metallic thunder that felt more creature than machine. What engine is that? His airspeed indicator sagged. The Zero began to shake, starving for lift in the thin air. The familiar confidence in his chest flickered. The American fighter continued upward, climbing with an aggression that felt unnatural. 6 seconds. That's how long the American pilot had before reaching the apex. 5. Brass casings rattled around his boots. 4. The R-2800 engine howled, pushing air like a living thing. 3. The sky fell silent, terrifyingly silent as he reached weightlessness. 2. The Hellcat's nose pitched over. 1. Gravity returned like a hammer. The American snapped into a perfect hammerhead turn, the kind of maneuver that should have torn a heavy aircraft apart. Instead, it looked fluid, almost lazy, as the fighter dropped down behind Fukui like a descending executioner. The first bullets hit at 400 meters, then 350, then 300. 6 Brownings unleashed a storm of fire that tore into Fukui's Zero with a violence he'd never experienced. The cockpit vibrated like it was being chewed apart. A line of holes stitched across his left wing, fuel misting into the wind. The smell of burning metal filled his lungs. Tunnel vision closed around him. This cannot be happening. He kicked the rudder, threw the aircraft into a spin, an act of desperation, not skill. The world flipped, sky and ocean trading places every half-second. The Zero shrieked under the stress as Fukui fought, gravity fought, panic fought, the reality forming in his mind. The American's fire stopped. He wasn't chasing. He didn't need to. Fukui regained control just above the wave tops, the Zero trembling like a wounded animal. His hands shook on the stick. His breath came in ragged bursts. His wingman was gone, the reconnaissance plane they were escorting gone. The sky behind him was empty, but not because the enemy had fled, because the enemy had finished. As he limped back toward Marcus Island, smoke trailing from the holes in his fuselage, Fukui replayed the engagement over and over. The climb, the hammerhead, the impossible acceleration. The way the American fighter ignored, turned combat entirely, fighting in a vertical dimension the Zero couldn't survive in. Above the Pacific at that exact moment, the American pilot eased the Hellcat back to cruising power. The engine settled into a steady vibration through his seat. Salt air seeped through the canopy vents. His hands were calm, almost relaxed, like this had been just another training drill back in Texas. He had no idea the pilot he'd just shot to pieces was one of Japan's better aviators. No idea that Japanese intelligence had laughed at this aircraft 2 weeks earlier. No idea that his casual maneuver had just exposed the fatal flaw in an entire empire's doctrine. He simply checked his fuel, checked his ammo, and rejoined, his Division 3 Hellcats above 2 below, all linked by radio chatter the Japanese couldn't hear. Fukui would survive the landing. He would report what he saw, and headquarters would dismiss it. They could not accept the truth forming in that shattered cockpit. The Zero hadn't met an opponent. It had met its replacement, and in 30 days the laughing would stop. In 60, Japanese naval aviation would begin dying in the sky, and by the end of the war, the Hellcat would hold the most terrifying record of all the power to let an enemy live or die at its discretion. The disaster did not arrive with explosions. It arrived with numbers. Long before the Hellcat appeared in the Pacific sky, the mathematical collapse of Japanese naval aviation had already begun quietly and visibly beneath the shine of early victories. It was hidden in fuel ledgers, in cracked engine housings, in pilot rosters, where the names of aces never stopped thinning. But at the time, none of them saw it. They were too busy winning. For 2 years, the Zero had been a ghost slicing through Allied formations. It slipped past British Hurricanes like a blade through paper shredded, P-42s, Brewster Buffaloes, Dutch fighters, anything with wings. Mission reports read like fantasy: 2 losses versus 30 kills, 7 losses versus 103. Pilots toasted with confidence mechanics bragged that their aircraft didn't need armor because a true warrior doesn't expect to be hit. It felt invincible. But invincibility in war is just the first step toward blindness. Inside the maintenance sheds at Rabaul, the first cracks were already open. Mechanics hammered thin metal skins back into place, patched bullet holes with scrap, and prayed the engines would hold. Extra super duralumin, the Zero's miracle alloy, was running low. The factories in Japan were working at full capacity, yet every month production slipped further behind demand. "Do what you can," one chief mechanic muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead as he examined a Zero's airframe pitted by salt corrosion. "Just make it fly." Fly was the key word, not fight, not survive. The Zero's brilliance in 1941 had been purchased with a deadly mortgage: no armor plate, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no tolerance for damage. The design had been optimized for pre-war assumptions: short, sharp campaigns, low attrition, elite pilots, who would never allow themselves to be hit. But war did not care about philosophy. The first American engineers who examined a captured Zero in 1942 were stunned. They refused to believe an aircraft this fragile had dominated the Pacific. One kicked the wing root and said quietly, "This thing's a coffin with propellers." The Americans didn't panic. They studied, they compared, they tore the Zero apart and rebuilt its ghost in numbers, turn radius, wing loading, structural fatigue limits. And in those numbers they saw the plas. The Zero was a masterpiece, but it had no future. Meanwhile, in Japan, the leadership celebrated each victory like a prophecy. Pilots returned to bases, flushed with adrenaline, shouting about how easily American aircraft burned. Commanders nodded. Engineers cheered. The line pilots believed it too, believed they were superior, destined, chosen. But the Zero's dominance hid a problem Japan could not afford. It required experienced pilots to exploit its razor-thin margins. Every maneuver demanded precision. Every mistake was fatal. Every hit was catastrophic. And that meant every pilot lost was irreplaceable. The training pipeline, once the crown jewel of the Imperial Navy, began to choke. Aircraft losses mounted faster than instructors could be replaced. Fuel shortages forced trainees into gliders. Gunnery practice was cut to almost nothing. By early 1943, pilots were entering combat with less than half the hours needed to survive. At Combined Fleet Headquarters, Captain Minoru Genda examined American intelligence reports showing a new fighter in development, a heavy armored brute rumored to be twice the Zero's weight. He read the numbers and smirked. "The Americans," he declared, "have learned nothing. They still think machinery can replace skill." Admirals laughed. Staff officers nodded in agreement. The idea that weight could be an advantage was absurd in a doctrine built on perfect maneuverability. But while Japan clung to its dogma, America adapted. On the carrier decks of the Pacific, the U.S. Navy was practicing something Japan had never believed in: energy fighting, a doctrine built around altitude, speed, and teamwork. American pilots trained in predictable skies, firing thousands of rounds, coordinating by radio drilling, coordinated climbs, slashing attacks, and rapid disengagements. Japan trained artists. America trained systems. At first, Japan didn't notice the shift. American losses were still high. Wildcats still struggled to survive. Pilots still wrote letters home knowing the odds were poor. Battles like Coral Sea and Midway were close enough to give Japan the illusion that its air superiority remained intact, but the numbers were already turning. Behind every American loss was a production line capable of building 20 more. Behind every Zero loss was a hole that could not be filled. Factories in Japan strained under shortages of aluminum, steel, fuel, rubber. The Zero's alloy, its greatest advantage, became its Achilles heel. No other metal could replicate its weight-to-strength ratio, yet Japan couldn't produce enough of it. By mid-1943, cracks widened into fractures. Squadrons that once boasted veterans with 600 flight hours now launched boys with 200 or less. Aircraft that once gleamed on runways now arrived, patched, mismatched, barely airworthy. Commanders prayed for reinforcements that never came. Mechanics cannibalized grounded Zeros to keep 3 or 4 airworthy. Over the Philippines, Formosa, New Britain, the same pattern repeated. A handful of elite aces carried entire engagements, while rookies died within minutes. Japan's aviation system was collapsing in slow motion. But the moment that transformed quiet collapse into disaster came in September 1943, the day Fukui encountered the Hellcat. That vertical climb, that impossible hammerhead, that storm of gunfire. It wasn't just a new aircraft. It was proof that Japan's assumptions, the very bones of their doctrine, no longer matched reality. The Zero's fragile elegance, its delicate balance of speed and maneuverability, its dependence on elite pilots, all of it had been overtaken by a machine built, not just to outperform it, but to erase the philosophy that created it. And yet, back in intelligence rooms across the Pacific, the reports were brushed aside. An isolated incident, pilot error, American exaggeration. No one wanted to accept what the numbers were screaming. Japan wasn't losing battles. It was losing the entire system that made victory possible. The disaster was already here. The Hellcat would simply reveal it. Before the Hellcat became a symbol of American dominance, it was just a sketch on a table born from frustration, exhaustion, and a man almost no one remembered. His name was William Bill Schwendler Grumman's quiet chief engineer. Not a pilot, not a warrior, not someone who looked like he belonged in a story about fire and steel. He was a thin, pale man with tired eyes and a habit of wiping his glasses when he grew nervous. Most pilots barely remembered his face. Some meeting rooms he entered silently enough that people forgot he was there at all. He did not shout, did not brag, did not demand attention. He simply watched. From the corner of maintenance hangars, from the edge of carrier decks vibrating with takeoffs, from behind pilots as they pointed angrily at bullet holes and cracks in their Wildcats. And what he heard most was fear spoken in the calm, almost casual tone of men trying not to admit they were scared. Can't climb with the Zero. Can't dive long without shaking apart. They get behind me in seconds. I need something that lets me live long enough to make a choice up there. Bill absorbed every word like scripture. He had never been in combat, but he carried the guilt of someone who felt responsible for the men who were. Each time a pilot didn't return, he blamed the machine, not the man. When the first wrecked Wildcats came back from early Pacific battles, Bill stood over them like they were bodies. He ran his fingers along the torn metal. He noticed the patterns that bullets made. He saw where armor should have been and wasn't. He saw where engines struggled for breath. He saw where the aircraft bent under stress it should have survived. And every night, long after others had gone home, he stayed in his cluttered office filled with yellowing blueprints. A dim lamp cast shadows across stacks of calculations. Coffee cooled beside his elbow. He sketched, erased, sketched again, sometimes shaking his head in frustration, sometimes whispering numbers under his breath. He was not designing a fighter. He was designing a promise that a pilot climbing into the cockpit wouldn't be entering a coffin. A promise that the aircraft would shield him, not abandon him. A promise that survival could be engineered, not prayed for. Most of Grumman's management didn't understand what Bill was building. When he proposed heavy armor, they frowned. When he proposed a massive engine, they questioned him. When he proposed redesigning the entire airframe, they said it was too risky, too costly, too far from Navy expectations. He continued anyway, not because he wanted glory, but because he feared what would happen if he didn't. One mechanic remembered walking past Bill's desk late one night. The engineer was staring at one of his own sketches, an early form of the Hellcat, his hand resting gently on the paper like it was fragile. "It has to protect them," Bill whispered, voice cracking. "They don't have anything else." Most people never saw this version of him, the doubting one, the exhausted one, the one who worried he might be wrong. Only one person understood him fully, John Jimmy Thatch, the Navy pilot who survived Zero encounters early in the war and developed the famous Thatch weave. Thatch saw something in Bill that others missed, a stubborn brilliance hidden under quiet mannerisms. They spoke often in low tones over drafts and test data. Thatch explained the terror of climbing into a Wildcat, knowing the Zero could outclimb, outturn, and outrun him. Bill listened, scribbling notes. Thatch described energy fighting and the need for power, altitude, and radios. Bill nodded, eyes sharpening. In those conversations, the seed of the Hellcat's philosophy took root. Build a fighter that doesn't ask the pilot to be a hero just to survive. At the same time, on the other side of the war, Japanese ace Saburo Sakai wrote in his diary about his own rising unease. Even in victory, something felt wrong, a sense that American aircraft were slowly changing, becoming tougher, harder to kill. He dismissed the feeling, but it lingered like a shadow trailing the sun. American planes fly like trucks, he once wrote, heavy, wasteful. But someday, they will use that weight properly. That someday was approaching faster than he knew. Back in Long Island, Bill stared at a fresh blueprint taped to the wall. The design was heavier than anything Japan believed possible. Taller landing gear, sturdier wings, a monstrous engine, thick armor, 6 machine guns instead of 4. To most, it looked ridiculous. To Bill, it looked like survival. He didn't care that early reviewers laughed. He didn't care that Navy officials were cautious. He didn't care that some pilots doubted a heavy fighter could ever win a turning fight. Because Bill wasn't building a turning fighter. He was building a new kind of warplane, one that fought vertically, one that used weight like a weapon, one that turned altitude into dominance and armor into second chances. He was building the aircraft that would change the Pacific. But on that night, staring at the blueprint with tired eyes, Bill didn't see history. He saw a pilot climbing into a cockpit. He saw his family waiting for him. He saw the fear behind their smiles. And he whispered to himself, if I do this right, he gets to come home. The idea didn't arrive with triumph. It arrived with failure. It was past midnight in the Grumman Engineering Building, the kind of hour when silence becomes a second atmosphere. Fluorescent lights hummed above, drafting tables littered with scraps of aluminum differential equations, broken pencils, coffee rings, and crumpled pages. Bill Schwendler sat hunched over a clean sheet of vellum, staring at it like it was a verdict he was terrified to read. The last test had been a disaster. The prototype, too light, too fragile, too familiar, had twisted under maximum power and nearly ripped its own wings off. The Navy liaison wanted a report by morning. Executives wanted reassurance. Pilots wanted something that could keep them alive. Bill had none of it. He rubbed his temples, feeling the exhaustion pooling behind his eyes. He glanced at a photograph taped beside his desk, 5 young pilots from VF, 3 smiling beside a row of Wildcats. 2 had already been killed over the Solomons. He whispered to the photo, if I don't get this right, more of you won't come home. The room was still, except for the sound of paper shifting as he reached for a rejected blueprint, a heavy wing concept he'd sketched months earlier, dismissed by management, mocked by visiting officers, shelved as too radical. He unfolded it. A longer fuselage, thicker wing spars, a monstrous engine mount, armor everywhere. The aircraft looked like a brawler compared to the sleek, airy Zero. Pilots would laugh. Commanders would panic. Bureaucrats would smother it. Bill stared at the sketch, heart thumping. What if they're wrong? What if heavy isn't a flaw? What if heavy is the breakthrough? For the first time, he let himself imagine an unorthodox concept, an American fighter that didn't try to turn with the Zero at all, one that refused the horizontal fight entirely, a fighter that moved like a meteor, a fighter that climbed like a rising storm, a fighter that used weight as a weapon. He pulled the blueprint closer. This might work, he whispered. But the moment the thought escaped his lips, he felt the fear behind it. Because this idea wasn't just unconventional, it was forbidden. The Navy demanded agility. Pilots demanded turn rate. Commanders demanded tradition. Bill's concept violated all of it. As he traced the heavy wing design with his finger, a tremor of excitement ran through him, and then the dread arrived right behind it. If he pushed this idea, he risked everything, his credibility, his position, and the trust of the pilots he was trying to save. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. What if they're not ready? What if I'm wrong? What if this kills more men than it saves? The guilt twisted inside him like wire. That was when the office door creaked open. Jimmy Thatch stepped in, still in uniform, smelling faintly of oil and seawater from a day spent training on Long Island. He looked exhausted, physically worn, mentally wired. He noticed Bill's expression immediately. "You look like you're about to confess a crime," Thatch said softly. Bill didn't speak. Thatch walked to the drafting table, studied the blueprint, and stopped breathing. "Bill," he whispered. "What is this?" Bill swallowed. "It's everything the Navy told us not to build." Thatch scanned the design again, tracing the big wings, the engine, mount the armor. "This isn't a fighter," Thatch murmured. "This is an ambush predator." Bill nodded, ashamed of the idea, even as he clung to it. "It's too heavy," Bill said. "It won't outturn anything. It won't fit the old doctrine. They'll say it's reckless. They'll say it's impossible." Thatch didn't flinch. He leaned in. He tapped the center of the blueprint. "Bill, this is exactly what we need. The Zero owns the turning fight, so stop fighting their war." He looked up, eyes blazing despite the fatigue. "Give us something that climbs. Give us something that dives. Give us something that can take a hit and keep fighting. Give us something that lets us choose when to engage, when to live." Bill exhaled shakily, as if someone had finally spoken aloud the thing he'd been afraid to believe. "You think the Navy will approve it?" he asked. Thatch gave a tired laugh. "They'll hate it. At first." He placed a hand on Bill's shoulder. "But build it anyway." A silence settled between them, one of those rare, heavy pauses when the future shifts in ways no one can measure yet. Outside, a cold wind rattled the windows. Inside, Bill felt something he hadn't felt in months: conviction. He slid the blueprint away and grabbed a fresh sheet. The pencil moved gently at first, then faster, then with a surgeon's precision. Shapes formed, angles corrected, ratios tightened, numbers lined up like soldiers. He wasn't sketching anymore. He was committing, and as he drew, the forbidden idea grew teeth. He widened the wings. He reinforced the fuselage. He thickened the armor. He expanded the ammunition wells, not 4 guns, but 6. He increased the fuel capacity for range the Zero could never match. Every stroke violated another rule. Every measurement defied another doctrine. Every note contradicted another assumption. But after 2 hours of relentless work, Bill stopped and stared. The aircraft on the page was unlike anything in American service. It was heavy. It was rugged. It was unapologetically powerful. It was born to fight in the vertical realm, where the Zero suffocated. It was the Hellcat, its first true form. Thatch studied the final sketch, softening his exhausted features. "This will change everything," he said quietly. Bill shook his head, vulnerable honesty rising to the surface. "No, the pilots will. I'm just giving them a chance." He rolled the blueprint carefully, almost reverently. Tomorrow he would present the forbidden design to Grumman leadership. They might reject it. They might bury it. They might accuse him of over-engineering madness. But tonight, as the first light of dawn crept under the window blinds, Bill understood the truth. Every breakthrough begins as an idea someone is afraid to say out loud. And this idea, this impossible rule-breaking, heavy-winged, armor-clad monster, might be the only thing standing between American pilots and the deadly mathematics of the Zero. Bill whispered one last time before turning off the lamp, "If they give me one chance, I'll build the fighter that ends their fear." Bill Schwendler arrived at the design review meeting with the rolled blueprint tucked under his arm like a secret he wasn't sure he had the right to carry. The conference room overlooked the Grumman airfield, an expanse of grey runway shimmering in the morning haze. Outside, Wildcats roared to life for another day of training flights. Inside, the mood was far colder. Executives, Navy liaisons, test pilots, project officers, they filled the long oak table like a firing squad waiting for permission to shoot. Bill unrolled the blueprint carefully, smoothing it flat with anxious hands. Silence. Then laughter. Actual laughter. Short, sharp, dismissive breaths. The Navy liaison commander, Halberd, squinted at the design as if trying to decipher a joke. "Is this a fighter or a flying brick?" One of the test pilots, Lieutenant Kramer, leaned back with a smirk. "If the Zero sees this thing in the sky, it'll die laughing before the fight even starts." A project executive tapped the paper with a pencil. "Schwendler, you're asking us to triple the structural mass, add armor, reinforce every load-bearing surface, increase fuel reserves, and mount an engine that practically eats propeller shafts for breakfast. He leaned closer, voice dropping to a dangerous tone. This is not Navy doctrine. This is not Grumman doctrine. This is recklessness. Bill kept his voice, even though his pulse hammered in his throat. The Zero dominates the horizontal fight. We need to go vertical. We need altitude, energy, durability. Durability, Commander Halberd cut him off. Fighters aren't built to take hits. They're built to avoid them. Bill felt his chest tighten. Sir, tell that to the pilots who didn't come home. The room froze. For a moment, Halberd's jaw clenched not with sympathy but with offense. We will not redesign naval aviation based on emotional appeals. Bill swallowed hard. He knew this was going badly, but he didn't expect it to fall apart this quickly. Kramer shook his head, pointing at the wing design. This will kill pilots during carrier landings. Too much weight, too much inertia, no finesse. Another officer snorted. America doesn't need a heavyweight slugger. We need agility. Someone else chimed in. Japan wins with precision. We should match them, not build a monster and pray it flies. They weren't just rejecting his design, they were dismantling his reasoning piece by piece. And no one, absolutely no one, was on his side. Then the sabotage began. A senior executive slid a folder across the table. Internal memos selectively chosen, test data, cost projections, documents assembled specifically to bury Bill's design before it took its first breath. Schwendler, the executive, said the Navy already allocated resources to incremental improvements to the Wildcat. Your proposal would divert manpower budget and machining time we cannot spare. He tapped the folder. And the Zero. It's already showing signs of slowing momentum in the Pacific. We don't need this kind of risk. Bill wanted to scream. He wanted to grab the blueprint, slam it against the table, and shout that men were dying because everyone here refused to see the truth. But he stayed still, knuckles whitening against the edge of the table. He spoke softly. If we build a fighter that only matches the Zero, we lose. We need one that changes the rules. Halberd's expression hardened. This design is denied. The words hit like a physical blow. Denied. The room moved on as if stamping out his work was routine. Officers gathered their folders. Executives stood. Conversations resumed. Bill stood frozen, staring at the blueprint as if it were a wounded animal. As the room emptied, Jimmy Thach slipped in through the side door. He'd heard whispers of what happened. He saw the look on Bill's face and understood instantly. They shot it down, didn't they? Thach asked. Bill didn't speak. He rolled the blueprint mechanically, his movements stiff and fragile. Thach exhaled, slowly glancing at the empty chairs. They're fighting the last war. Bill's voice cracked. They won't even listen. They think heavy is suicide. Thach lowered his voice. You weren't wrong. They are. He leaned closer. But we push anyway. Bill stared at him, torn between hope and defeat. Jimmy. They just buried the project. Thach's eyes sharpened. Not if I unbury it. He reached for the blueprint. Come with me. They walked across the airfield to a small hangar near the edge of the test runway. Inside, mechanics worked on an early prototype, the XF6F1, a transitional design meant to be the next step after the Wildcat. It was adequate. It was safe. It was uninspired. Thach circled the prototype like a predator assessing prey. How much of your heavy-wing concept can we fit into this without permission? He asked. Bill blinked. Jimmy, that's against regulations, Thach finished. Good. That means it might actually keep someone alive. Bill hesitated. They could fire us. They could fire me, Thach corrected. You. They'll just call you eccentric. Bill shook his head. This is sabotage. This, Thach said firmly, is survival. Mechanics overheard the conversation. A few drifted closer. These were men who'd seen too many pilots crash, too many aircraft fail under stress the Zero forced upon them. One mechanic wiped his hands on a rag. Tell us what to do. Bill unfolded the blueprint on the wing of the prototype. His hands trembled not from fear, but from a rising, dangerous sense of purpose. They worked in secret, reinforced the wing spars, adjusted the control surfaces, modified the engine mounts, thickened the armor plate, expanded the gun bays. Each modification pushed the prototype closer to the forbidden idea. Each change was a quiet act of rebellion against doctrine, but sabotage came from the other side too. A project officer discovered unauthorized modifications. He stormed into the hangar face, red with anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing? This is not approved." Thatch stepped between him and the mechanics. "We're fixing a problem before it kills more of my men. This isn't your decision. Neither is letting them die." The confrontation drew attention. Voices rose. Threats were exchanged. The officer threatened to shut the hangar down. Thatch threatened to report him for negligence. The man stormed off, vowing consequences. When the door slammed behind him, Bill exhaled shakily. "This is going to get ugly." Thatch nodded. "Good. Means we're doing something that matters." That night, as Bill walked to his car under the dim yellow lights of the parking lot, he replayed every argument, every rejection, every threat. The weight of the project felt like an anchor tied to his chest. He reached the car, leaned against it, and closed his eyes. Then he made the decision. He would build it. He would fight for it. He would break every rule necessary. Because now the conflict was bigger than engineering. It was bigger than doctrine. It was bigger than Grumman. Hellcat wasn't a machine anymore. It was a rebellion. And rebellions don't stop. They escalate. The prototype, what the team jokingly called the Hellship, sat crouched at the edge of the runway like a predator, unsure of its own strength. In the cold dawn light, its dark blue paint reflected streaks of orange and gold. Mechanics moved around it in tense silence, their breath hanging in the frigid air, as if the aircraft itself exhaled through them. Bill Schwendler stood farther back, hands buried in his pockets to hide the shaking. He could hear his pulse louder than the rumble of early morning wildcats warming up on the far end of the field. Today was the first real test of the forbidden idea. Today, the aircraft would either prove him right or expose him as the man who gambled with American lives. Jimmy Thach paced in front of the prototype, jaw-tight eyes locked on the wings Bill had spent 3 months secretly reinforcing. His flight gear hung loosely from his frame, and he looked like a man preparing for both glory and a funeral. "You sure you want to fly it?" Bill asked softly. Thach didn't turn. "It's my design too," he said. "If it kills me, at least we'll know who to blame." The attempt at humor collapsed between them, too heavy, too real. A test officer approached his clipboard like a shield. "We still don't have authorization for this flight," he warned. "If anything goes wrong, I'll deny I ever saw you." Thach grabbed the helmet from the mechanic's hands. "We're not asking for permission," he said. "We're asking for answers." The first test. Failure. The prototype roared to life with a vibration so violent it rattled Bill's ribs even from 50 feet away. The R-2800 engine howled deeper and angrier than any engine Grumman had ever mounted on a fighter. It sent dust swirling across the tarmac in spirals that looked like miniature storms. Thach taxied to the runway, lined up and paused. For a moment the field fell silent except for the cold wind scraping against the metal hangars. Bill held his breath. Thach pushed the throttle forward. The engine detonated with a booming growl propeller biting into the air. The aircraft lurched forward, accelerating faster than expected. Mechanics watching from behind the barrier exchanged startled glances. "Come on," Bill whispered. At 80 knots, the aircraft shook. At 95, it wobbled. At 110, the left-wing loading spiked into dangerous territory. Thach felt it first. The stick trembled in his hands like a frightened living thing. "Stabilizing," Thach reported over the radio. But it wasn't stabilizing. It was deteriorating. The reinforced wings weren't the problem. Bill had designed them for absurd stress. It was the tail. At high takeoff loads, airflow became erratic. A harmonic resonance built through the fuselage like a metal scream. "Cut power," Bill shouted into the radio. Jimmy cut power, but Thach didn't cut power. He pushed the throttle harder. "We need to know what it does at full pressure," he said. The aircraft lurched. The left aileron dipped dangerously. The tail buffeted so hard the entire prototype shuddered like a man in a seizure. Bill's knees nearly buckled. "Jimmy, abort!" he yelled. "Abort!" The engine roared. The wings flexed. The Hellcat prototype clawed at the air, and then dropped. Thach yanked the stick back so hard the shoulder harness dug into his chest. The wheels slammed the runway, bounced violently, and skidded sideways in a blast of smoke. The aircraft veered off the main runway and plowed through a patch of weeds before coming to a grinding halt in a cloud of dust. Silence. Then Bill ran. Mechanics followed. Officers followed. Radios crackled. Boots pounded the ground. Thach's canopy popped open. He climbed out slowly, panting face, pale hands trembling from the force of the near crash. Bill reached him first. "Are you hurt?" Thach shook his head. Just scared out of my damn mind. The test officer arrived next, furious. That's it. We're done. I'm grounding this project. This aircraft is a hazard. This whole idea. Bill wasn't listening. He was staring at the prototype. It wasn't destroyed. It wasn't broken. It had failed, but it was alive. He touched the fuselage gently, feeling heat radiating through the metal. We can fix this, he whispered. Thach, hearing him, let out a shaky laugh. Of course you think that. The officer snapped Schwendler. This isn't a matter of fixing. This is incompetence. Bill stood slowly, hands trembling with rage he'd never shown before. No, he said. This is innovation. The breakdown. The hangar that night felt suffocating. Engine parts lay scattered across the floor. Schematics littered every table. Mechanics whispered anxiously about the near crash. Doubt seeped into the air like a toxic fog. Bill slammed his fist onto a drafting table, scattering papers. I failed, he said, voice breaking. I built a death trap. Thach sat on the workbench, bruised from the harness impact. You built a machine too new for its own skin, he said. There's a difference. Bill shook his head. If the tail breaks at high speed, the pilot dies. If the stability oscillates past a threshold, the pilot dies. If the airflow breaks down, he covered his face with his hands. I gave them something dangerous. For the first time, Bill wasn't afraid the Navy would fire him. He was afraid he didn't deserve to build aircraft at all. Thach stood wincing and placed a hand on Bill's shoulder. You're allowed to break before the breakthrough, he said softly. Every engineer does. The question is whether you stay broken. Bill didn't respond, so Thach pulled him to the prototype's tail section. Look, he said, tapping the bent metal. This is where the resonance started. But the airframe didn't collapse, and the wings perfect. The engine mount flawless. He stepped back. You didn't fail. You missed something. Bill stared at the damaged stabilizer, tears silently forming. What did I miss? He whispered. Thach answered with a tired smile. You'll figure it out. That's who you are. The breakthrough. Bill didn't sleep. He didn't go home. He paced the hangar through the night, replaying the flight in his mind, every vibration, every oscillation, every shift in airflow. At 3:12 a.m., he froze. A single equation, something he'd dismissed weeks earlier, flashed in his mind. Tail resonance factor. The airflow at high takeoff power wasn't just turbulent, it was misaligned with the stabilizer's harmonic frequency. He rushed to a drafting table and began sketching new angle on the vertical stabilizer modified elevator control ratio, trimmed mass balance reinforced hinge. For 2 straight hours he scribbled, calculated, erased, recalculated. At dawn, Thach returned with coffee and saw the transformation on the page. You fixed it, he said. Bill shook his head. No, the aircraft fixed itself. I just finally listened. Mechanics flooded in. Work began instantly. By afternoon, the prototype had a new stabilizer assembly, stronger, cleaner, perfectly aligned with the airflow curve. The test officer protested, but Thach shut him down. Either we fly it again, he said coldly, or you explain to the Navy why you're blocking the aircraft that might win us the Pacific. The man backed down. The second test. The sun was setting when Thach climbed back into the cockpit. The sky glowed red, an omen, a warning, a promise. Bill stood where he had stood that morning, fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. Thach taxied out, paused. The engine roared. The prototype accelerated. 80 knots smooth. 95 stable. 110 perfect. Thach pulled back on the stick, and the aircraft lifted into the air with a confidence so clean it made Bill gasp. The Hellcat had found its wings. Thach climbed steeply, testing stress loads. No vibration, no oscillation, no tail resonance. He banked, rolled dove. The aircraft responded like a creature alive, powerful, certain, eager. Bill. Thach's voice crackled over the radio, breathless with awe. This thing climbs like it's trying to leave Earth. Bill collapsed onto a crate, laughter and tears mixing freely. The breakthrough wasn't a moment. It was a rebirth. The forbidden idea had survived its own trial by fire. It had become real. It had become unstoppable. And soon, in the skies over the Pacific, the Zero would discover what had just been born. The first reports didn't sound like revolution. They sounded like confusion. On the morning of October 4th, 1943, barely days after the redesigned prototype was approved for production, the first squadron of F6F Hellcats launched from USS Essex into a pale Pacific dawn. Pilots initially didn't know what to make of the new aircraft. It felt heavier underfoot, its engine vibration deeper, its climb more forceful than anything they had flown. Some joked it was a flying jeep, others tapped the armor plating with a mix of amusement and disbelief. But when the sun lifted above the horizon and the squadron broke formation to climb toward Japanese-held Wake Island, something changed. The Hellcat didn't slow as it climbed, it accelerated. Altitude stacked beneath it like stepping stones, each 1,000-foot mark arriving faster than the last. Pilots who once had to nurse wildcats into the vertical now found themselves rising with the confidence of men who finally had gravity on their side. At 25,000 feet, Lieutenant Ray Hawkins radioed his wingman. "This thing's got power to spare. I'm not fighting the plane anymore, I'm riding it." The first shockwave. Below them, Japanese radar detected incoming fighters. The defending A6M Zeros scrambled their green silhouettes, slicing into the sky with the familiar grace that had once terrified Allied pilots. But when they reached interception altitude, the usual dance did not begin. The Zeros expected horizontal movement, turns, evasions, breakaways. Instead, the Hellcats simply dove. And the dive was a murder stroke. The Zeros tried to follow, but their engines choked at high altitude, throttle the airframe trembling as they attempted a pursuit they were never designed for. Their turn radius meant nothing, their agility became irrelevant. Their mastery of the horizontal fight collapsed under the weight of American vertical energy. In the next 8 minutes, the first combat test of the Hellcat was complete. 12 Hellcats, 8 Zeros destroyed, no American losses. The numbers reached Combined Fleet Headquarters in Rabaul. Officers stared at the decoded message as if the paper itself had betrayed them. "This cannot be correct," one muttered. But it was. And worse, there would be more. The rising tide. By December 1943, multiple air groups transitioned to Hellcats. The transformation was immediate. 1. Kill ratios skyrocketed. Aerial engagements that once ended in chaos now ended in ruthless American efficiency. Hellcat pilots stacked altitude in pairs, forming layered ambush towers that trapped Zeros in vertical funnels. 2. Japanese commanders reported enemy attacks of unnatural precision. From above, Hellcats struck like falling blades, one slash, one burst, then gone before the Zero could respond. 3. Radar integration created a new form of warfare. American fighter direction officers vectored Hellcats to ideal intercept points, giving them an omniscience Japanese aviators described as fighting ghosts guided by gods. 4. Pilot survivability changed the war's psychology. American pilots who once entered battle expecting death now returned with fuel to spare and guns still hot. And with every returning aircraft came gun camera footage, cold, undeniable proof of the new order in the sky. The shock in Tokyo. Intelligence officers across Japan stared at growing stacks of reports, monotonous, terrifying lists of lost aircraft and dead pilots. What frightened them wasn't the kill counts, it was the pattern. Every engagement followed the same trajectory. Hellcats climbed beyond Zero capability. Zeros attempted pursuit. Zeros stalled. Hellcats dove and killed. Repeat. The Zero's reign had depended on assumptions, superiority in agility, pilot skill, combat philosophy. The Hellcat didn't challenge those assumptions. It ignored them. A Zero ace wrote desperately in his diary after surviving his first Hellcat encounter. "It is like fighting gravity itself. They are not pilots, they are an American system. We who believed ourselves warriors are prey." The cascade effect. By early 1944, the impact reached every layer of the Pacific War. Carrier tactics changed overnight. Admiral Mark Mitcher realized something stunning: American carriers no longer had to strike first to survive. The Hellcat turned carriers into floating fortresses. Japanese raids that once forced U.S. fleets into evasive maneuvers were now intercepted 50 miles out, annihilated long before they approached. Island assaults became feasible. The Hellcat swept skies clean over Tarawa, Makin, Kwajalein, Saipan. What once required overwhelming naval gunfire now required only a squadron of Hellcats establishing uncontested airspace. Japanese logistics collapsed. Every attempt to reinforce island garrisons ended with transports burning under strafing Hellcats. The aircraft had enough range to hunt convoys far beyond frontline zones. Pilot confidence inverted. American aviators went from underdogs to executioners. Japanese pilots went from hunters to hunted. This psychological reversal was catastrophic. Veterans grew hesitant. Rookies panicked. Entire squadrons dissolved on first contact. The Mariners, Hellcat ascendancy. June 19, 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was not luck, it was not chance. It was the inevitable result of the Hellcat system reaching maturity. Radar spotted the first Japanese wave at 150 miles. Fighter directors vectored Hellcat divisions with clinical precision. Altitude stacked, sun angles aligned. Attack geometry tightened like a noose. In 12 minutes 42, Japanese aircraft fell. By nightfall, 346 had been destroyed. Losses that once would have shattered the American fleet became footnotes: 30 aircraft. None from Hellcat inferiority, only flak fuel accidents. Japan lost its air arm in a single day. When reports reached the Imperial Palace, one staff officer wrote, "We are witnessing the death of our sky." The true impact. The Hellcat did not merely outperform the Zero, it erased the doctrine that birthed it. It redefined how dogfights were fought, how fleets were defended, how carriers projected power, how pilots survived, how radar shaped battlefields, how attrition became a weapon, how industry defeated ideology. It was not a fighter. It was the embodiment of a nation's industrial, tactical, and psychological evolution, a system so integrated engine armor, training, radar maintenance doctrine that Japanese pilots no longer fought airplanes. They fought inevitability. And inevitability always wins. The war ended not with a roar, but with a broadcast: Emperor Hirohito's trembling words drifting across shattered cities and empty airfields. When the static faded, the last Zero pilots at Atsugi stood motionless beside their grounded aircraft, staring at a horizon they had once ruled. Among them was Saburo Sakai. His surviving eye, scarred, dimmed, aged beyond its years, followed the distant dots approaching from the east. They grew larger, clearer, impossibly familiar. Blue silhouettes, wings like broad shoulders, engines rumbling with a power Japan never learned to build. The first American aircraft to land in occupied Japan were F6F Hellcats, the same machine he once laughed at, the same machine that hunted his friends, the same machine that almost killed him. Sakai watched as Lieutenant Robert Vasu climbed down from his cockpit. The American ace, young, unscarred, almost casual, walked toward the Japanese pilots, who had spent years trying to shoot men like him out of the sky. Sakai bowed, not in defeat, in acknowledgement. "You flew well," he said quietly. Vasu nodded with equal solemnity. "So did you." For a moment, two men who had lived inside the machinery of national hatred stood together in silence, breathing the same humid air surrounded by wreckage they had helped create. Above them, the engines of resting Hellcats ticked softly as they cooled. Thousands of miles away, on a quiet Long Island afternoon, Bill Schwendler stepped out of the Grumman plant for the first time without urgency. The war was over. Production lines that once roared 24 hours a day were falling silent. Workers who had lived on coffee and patriotism now stood in small clusters, uncertain what peacetime was supposed to feel like. Bill carried a stack of letters in his hands, letters pilots had written him during the war. Some came from aviators he would never meet, others from men whose names he would later find engraved on memorials. He sat on a bench overlooking the empty runway and unfolded one of the letters. "I lived because this aircraft forgave my mistakes." Another. "Every time the Hellcat brought me home, I whispered, 'Thank you,' to whoever built it." Another. "My daughter was born last week. I wouldn't have met her without the armor you insisted on." Bill folded the last letter gently, the weight of the words settling over him. During the war, he'd lived in a constant state of urgency, fear, pressure, responsibility heavy enough to crush most men. Now that the world had gone quiet, he finally felt the impact of what he had done. He hadn't built a weapon. He had built a lifeline. Near the far end of the runway, a small group of pilots walked toward him, men who had flown Hellcats in the Marianas Leyte Gulf Okinawa. They greeted him shyly, almost awkwardly, like meeting a man they owed too much to acknowledge casually. One stepped forward, extending his hand. "You don't know us," the pilot said, "but we know you. We just wanted to say, we made it home, because your aircraft didn't quit on us." Bill shook his hand, but the words hit harder than any medal or commendation ever could. He cleared his throat, voice cracking. "You came home because you didn't quit." "No," the pilot replied gently. "We came home because you refused to build the fighter everyone expected and gave us the one we needed." They left him standing alone, overwhelmed, staring at the tarmac where the first Hellcat prototype had nearly killed Jimmy Thash, and where thousands of others had later launched into battle and returned alive. Jimmy Thatch did come home, older, quieter, carrying memories like bruises that never faded. He kept a framed photograph of the first successful test flight on his desk. Sometimes he caught himself touching the glass without realizing it, as if reassuring himself the moment had truly happened. His son once asked him, "Dad, what did the Hellcat feel like?" Thatch smiled, the kind of small, tired smile only veterans understand. "It felt," he said, "like having a second chance every time I took off." Back in Japan, Sakai lived long enough to see an era where American and Japanese pilots flew together as allies. He became a quiet advocate for peace, often repeating a single line to young aviators. "In war, courage matters, but in peace, humility matters more." He rarely spoke of his last true dogfight because he knew what it symbolized. Not defeat, not shame, but transition. From a world where skill decided survival to a world where systems did. He kept a small model of the Hellcat on his shelf until the day he died. Years later, when the Smithsonian restored one of the surviving F6F Hellcats, an elderly engineer visited the museum during closed hours. Bill stood before the aircraft in the gentle museum, lighting the blue paint gleaming like it did on its first day in the Pacific. He placed a hand on its wing. The metal was cold, but to him it felt alive. Not because of the thousands of Japanese aircraft it destroyed, not because it became the most successful carrier fighter in history, but because of the thousands of Americans it brought home. He whispered the same words he'd whispered the night he finished its first blueprint. "Thank you for keeping them safe." And for the first time since the war, he let himself cry. History often hides its most important lessons inside the machines we build, not the men who fly them. The F6F Hellcat is one of those lessons, quiet on the surface, devastating once understood. It didn't dominate the Pacific because it was the fastest or the sleekest or the most elegant. It dominated because it represented a shift in how war and survival would be decided for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. It marked the moment when individual brilliance could no longer carry a nation. The age of aces was ending. The age of systems had begun. Look closely at the Hellcat's story, and you see the blueprint of every modern conflict. Technology beats tradition. Integration beats improvisation. Training beats instinct. Data beats legend. And industry decides endurance. Japan built warriors. America built a machine that protected its warriors. The result wasn't just victory, it was inevitability. That same principle defines the world today. Airframes have become algorithms, dogfights have become radar signatures, situational awareness has become satellites, encrypted comms and software lines longer than runways. Nations still boast of elite pilots and brave fighters, but the truth remains unchanged. A lone hero cannot outrun a system built to replace uncertainty with overwhelming advantage. And yet, within that sobering reality, there's another lesson quieter but just as enduring. Behind every system, there is always a human who refuses to accept the world as it is. A human who draws a forbidden blueprint. A human who pushes back when doctrine says no. A human who sees the cracks before they become catastrophes. A human who risks consequences for a better outcome they may never live to witness. The Hellcat wasn't inevitable. It wasn't preordained. It wasn't created by committees or doctrines or slogans. It was created by a tired engineer named Bill, scribbling late at night under a dim lamp, driven by the simple belief that one more pilot deserved to come home alive. And that's the modern relevance. Innovation rarely begins with brilliance. It begins with responsibility. Every field today, engineering, medicine, aviation, cybersecurity, climate science, is shaped not by the loudest voices, but by the quiet people who decide that good enough is not acceptable when lives depend on their work. When we look at the Hellcat, now polished in museums or replayed in grainy combat footage, it's easy to see a symbol of American industrial might. But beneath its armor, beneath its steel ribs and roaring engine, sits something more fragile and more powerful. Human intention, the intention to protect, the intention to adapt, the intention to challenge what everyone assumed was unchangeable. And that is what makes the Hellcat timeless. not the kill ratio, not the production numbers, not the victories, but the reminder that the future belongs to those who build the system that outthinks the enemy before the enemy even realizes the rules have changed. In the end, the Japanese pilots were right about one thing: they brought swords to a gunfight. But the deeper truth, the one carved into the sky over the Pacific, is this: a nation that builds better warriors may win battles, but a nation that builds better systems will shape history. The Hellcat proved that, and in every modern conflict its shadow still flies.